In November 1971, Mykyta Mandryka was honored for his life work at a special reception held at the national headquarters of the Ukrainian Canadian Committee in Winnipeg on the occasion of his 85th birthday. Amazingly, the evening celebration made no direct reference to Mandryka's purpose for coming to Canada in the first place, namely as an organizer for the Prague-based emigre Ukrainian Party of Socialist Revolutionaries. The closest anyone came in this regard was the Ukrainian Canadian historian Mykyta Mandryka. But in the end, Mandryka regarded Mandryka's poetical works as his main calling and his major contribution to the treasure chest of Ukrainian culture, quote unquote. Now, I don't know about you, but when somebody comes to Canada as an organizer for a group called the Socialist Revolutionaries, and his main contribution to life in Ukrainian Canada is as a poet, alarm bells go off. This is in part, I might add, not because of just Mandryka's proclivity to sort of look at Ukrainian organizational life as a continual stream of development, but also for the fact that Mandryka himself was a bit shy about why he had come to Canada, mentioning in a biography in a history of Ukrainian literature he published earlier that that is, talking about himself, first aim in coming to Canada was to acquaint Ukrainian Canadians with the situation in Ukraine and the real face of Russian communism, and to join them in educational and cultural activity. It sounds pretty innocuous. Mandryka had become something of a venerable Ukrainian community mainstay, a respectable cultural figure. This was a far cry from when he first arrived in Winnipeg in September 1928, as a firebrand, ready and eager to change the shape of Ukrainian life in Canada. For Mandryka had come to see the fruition of an initiative to establish a solid socialist revolutionary presence in Canada. He had his supporters, namely the luminaries of the local Ukrainian People's Home, and his detractors, namely the leading members of the recently established Ukrainian Self-Reliance League. Mandryka's vision to Canada ultimately failed due to several factors, and I'll deal with these later, and by itself did not leave any lasting impression on the Ukrainian Canadian landscape. The events preceding his arrival, however, were instrumental in either, well, choose your word, expediting or forcing the establishment of the Ukrainian Self-Reliance League. Now, I just might mention briefly who, two major organizational blocks or groups will come up in discussion. One, the Ukrainian Self-Reliance League. This was a group that had coalesced, very much basically, should call it an indigenous Ukrainian Canadian elite, coming out of the more prominent educated members of the Ukrainian community in the early part of the century, people who had attended or who had become bilingual school teachers, set up the newspaper Ukrainsky Holos, the Ukrainian Voice, as well as the Mohila Institute in Saskatoon, Ursa, a residence cultural center. The other main group that we'll mention at some time will be the pro-communist Ukrainian Labor Farmer Temple Association, which was extremely well organized, nationally chartered in 1924, and very protective of its position as what it regarded as the representative group of the Ukrainian Canadian workers. Anyhow, I want to deal briefly with who the Socialist revolutionaries were at home in Prague and how they discovered America. In the wake of the failure of the Ukrainian Revolution, the Ukrainian Party of Socialist Revolutionaries regrouped outside Ukraine, albeit in competing factions, the main ones being the Vienna-based Foreign Delegation and the Prague-based Foreign Committee. By 1923-24, the Foreign Delegation had resolved differences with the Soviet regime and decided to return to Ukraine, leaving the Foreign Committee faction led by Mykyta Mandryka as the representative of the SRs in the West. Without going into details, the Socialist revolutionaries were a major force in Ukrainian life in Czechoslovakia. And this was very much through the influence of Shapoval, who was instrumental in establishing certain institutions such as the Ukrainian Technical and Husbandry Academy in Podebrady, as well as the Ukrainian Pedagogical and Ukrainian Sociological Institutes in Prague, as well as leading the Ukrainian Citizens Committee. At that time, the Czechoslovakian government was quite ready to aid Ukrainians and other emigre groups whose homelands had fallen into the orb of the Soviet Union in the expectation or hope of good relations with these respective nationalities once the USSR had collapsed. All the same, this support was tenuous, and the funds provided by the Czechs were sufficient to maintain Ukrainian activity at only a modest level. In other words, they were constantly underfunded, so you would have professors wearing threadbare clothes, which is also the case in Galicia at the time. In a bid to firm up finances and also just not knowing what the future held, Shapoval visited a number of larger Ukrainian American communities in the spring of 1927 with lectures on various themes. The main focus of this fundraising tour was a correspondence Ukrainian Workers' University, the proposed formation of which was announced in April 1927 in a Czech Ukrainian newspaper, just as Shapoval was setting off. The response in America to his tour was positive. Support committees were established in major centers in North America. And after Shapoval's return from overseas, an organizing committee for the university was struck. The tour also produced the specific demand for and the means to publish Велика революція Українська визвольна програма, a book sort of basically a compilation of SR writings that very much stands today as sort of, well, it's a compendium, but it's probably the best, most reflective piece of work in terms of their thinking. Shapoval had toured in the United States under the auspices of Obrona Ukrainy, a socialist organization with close ties to the Ukrainian Working Men's Association, which later became the Ukrainian Fraternal Association, that provided support for the Ukrainian Socialist Radical Party in Galicia. Now, I must mention that at that time it was headed by the eminent Dr. Andrij Makuch, who is no relation. People used to ask me this, but they seem to have forgotten by now. The key figure in Obrona Ukrainy was Miroslav Sechinsky, the man who had assassinated the hugely unpopular Galician governor Andrij Makuch in 1908, and then fled to America after his escape from prison. Shapoval established a solid working relationship with Sechinsky during his American tour, demonstrated in part by the fact that he published a short edition of the latter's memoirs after he returned to Prague. Sechinsky, in turn, undertook a speaking tour in Canada in the summer of 1927. So we have Shapoval coming to America, that's the US, in spring 1927, and then Shapoval, picking up the ball and going to Canada. Among other matters, he spoke about the need for Ukrainians to organize around economic and/or class issues, in effect, testing the ground for the formation of branches of Obrona Ukrainy in Canada. Sechinsky's lectures initially received a reasonably sympathetic review in the newspaper Ukrainsky Holos, that is the one edited by the, well, it's, if you call them the populists, the nationalists, the samostiniki is the most common term, edited by Miroslav Stechishin. However, the reaction of his brother, Julian Stechishin, the rector of the Mykyta Institute, was decidedly negative. At a talk at Edmonton's Khrushchevsky Institute on 23rd June, Stechishin intervened following the kind words of thanks to the speaker by MC Vladimir to state that, although we are pleased to greet our distant guest, we cannot agree with the contents of his presentation. He also telegraphed his brother Miroslav in August 1927, urging him to be less kind to the touring lecturer. You must not hold that tolerant attitude towards Sechinsky. People know who he is. He will do much harm unless you awake and say so, as Canadian Ukraine did. And this is significant because Sechinsky was something of a folk hero. He was the guy who had off the evil governor Platotsky, and so So, you know, he had a certain cachet, you know. It's just he continued to live, you know, so, you know, and be active. The Samostina concern with Syczynski's speaking tour may be attributed to three basic reasons. Firstly, Syczynski, like the SRs, was critical of Petlerite politics, to which the Samostinikists subscribed. Shapoval, in fact, labeled this as a variety of national fascism. Although in a practical sense, the SR opposition was based less on ideology per se, and more with what they regarded as the opportunistic policies and tactics of the Petlerites. Secondly, Syczynski was avowedly anti-clerical. Shapoval could also be blunt in the matter, quoting, "Most of all, we need to destroy the churches." I think that's as unequivocal a position as you might take. The Samostiniki, meanwhile, had embroiled themselves in religious politics with the formation of the Ukrainian Greek Orthodox Church in Canada. Thirdly, the establishment of Obrona Ukraine branches in Canada would eat into the base of Samostinik support. The socialists, notwithstanding their stance on class and economic issues, had a decided appeal to patriotic, secularly minded Ukrainians, the core of the Samostinik constituency. And this really, I think, is the essence of it all, because in the end, what we end up with is a rather unpleasant turf war. This last aspect undoubtedly came into play in the formation of the Ukrainian Self-Reliance League in December 1927. To that time, the Samostinik had existed as an amorphous group gathered around the Mykyta Institute in Saskatoon and its Edmonton and Winnipeg affiliates, the site of an annual all-peoples convention dealing with Ukrainian concerns in Canada, Ukrainsky Holos, and the Ukrainian Greek Orthodox Church in Canada. The unexpected challenge to make inroads into their base of support expedited the establishment of USRL in very short order. In other words, they go, if we don't have formal groups, we're open to poaching. This is a very colloquial way, but I think it's pretty accurate. Syczynski's visit to Canada was followed up in early 1928 with a lecture tour by Nikifor Hrihoriev, the SR's second in command, who came formally as a representative of the Ukrainian Sociological Institute. In addition to speaking on a variety of topics, Hrihoriev gauged the extent of SR support in Canada. He discovered that the Ukrainian People's Home in Winnipeg might well provide a base of organizational operations for the SRs in Canada, as well as the financial and logistic backing for the publication of an SR-style newspaper. The People's Home in Winnipeg had recently had a falling out with the Samostinik, and although the specifics are somewhat unclear, it seems like the matter of the increasingly less secular focus of the Samostinik figured prominently. Although that was a huge issue for it, you know. So I won't get into that, the details of that. What was needed was somebody to oversee the newspaper and work as an organizer, a task that eventually fell to Mandryka. There's I'll leave a section of my talk out. You know, one of the more bizarre incidents in Ukrainian Canadian history. If somebody's keen to know, just approach me later. Mykyta Mandryka was a good candidate for the position of SR organizer in the New World. The cave-born SR, born 1886, was well-educated, had a fair amount of political experience as a Zamstven co-op official, a member of the Central Rada, and UNR diplomat. He took the languages fairly well, learning Bulgarian as a diplomat and acquiring a fluency in English. He had been intimately involved in preparing texts for the Workers' University in Prague, and he had extensive speaking experience. As a bonus, Shapoval and Mandryka, by the latter's own admission, had not been getting along well in recent history. Mandryka saying that he had been troublesome as far as Shapoval was concerned, and would be better off sent away on assignment rather than staying around the home base. They didn't invent this. You know, this is in politics. You have somebody who's a rival or somebody you don't like, you send them on an important mission or post them to Washington or you know, something of that sort. So he sent him on an important mission, get him out of Prague. Mandryka came to Canada in the summer of 1928 via New York and the United States. After meeting en route with Miroslav Socialist, he crossed the border in Niagara Falls on 12 August 1928. He quickly arranged a gratis, quote-unquote, European correspondent railroad pass for himself, which held him in good stead in the future and began his Canadian adventure. At this time, the railroad companies had extensive land holdings, and they wanted to promote Canada. And one of the ways of promoting Canada was to have European correspondents write about Canada. And so they were quite willing to hand out passes to European correspondents. In this case, I think he probably arranged it through a sympathetic Ukrainian who worked for one of these colonization companies, as the land companies were commonly known. And but when you think about it, it ultimately saved him, hundreds of dollars. When he finally arrived in Winnipeg on 27 September 1928, Mandryka was welcomed royally by a dozen of the leading figures from the local Ukrainian national home. Socialist's directives from the Ukrainian Party of Socialist Revolutionaries was quite direct. One, to explain to Ukrainian Canadians, especially their leadership, the pan-Ukrainian peril posed by Bolshevism. That is, overcome their Galician view on this matter. Two, to establish a Ukrainian workers' organization from the working class and intelligentsia in cooperation with the Obrona Ukrainy, set up a new newspaper, and lay the groundwork for courses to be held at a workers' university. And third, to arrange the import of talented young SR members, agronomists, engineers, cooperative specialists, to assist with the matters above, and to lay the groundwork for the transfer of Ukrainian higher educational schools and institutions from Prague to Canada. So the dream, if you will call it, was to be able to transfer at least part of the Prague intelligentsia to Canada. They weren't sure what the reality in Canada was, but this was what ultimately what they were hoping for. At this juncture, Mandryka's chances for some degree of success seemed reasonably good. He had a home base from which to work, that's the people's home. He had a network of Obrona Ukrainy locals there to build on. He had the logistical backup of the SRs and the Obrona Ukrainy. He also had the good fortune to have resolved the matter of his status in Canada in fairly short order. Mandryka was facing potential deportation as an undesirable. He was a lefty. After, by his account, having been denounced as a subversive by the Samostiniki, but then received ministerial position to remain in Canada, seemingly indefinitely, most likely on the basis of his performance in a debate at the Calgary Ukrainian Labor Temple with Comrade Anton Wojtyszyn. I don't have the name for that. So in other words, the government noted that this guy's potentially a subversive. On the other hand, he's a useful subversive because he can get under the skin of the Ukrainian Canadian pro-communist left. So he's useful. Let's keep him for now. Mandryka spent the next 2 years working at a hectic pace on undertakings such as a newspaper, Proudly Voya, which started coming out in 1929, as well as a Proud Voya library, a series of small booklets. At least 3 came out, I don't know if more. Setting up a higher education course under the rubric of the Ukrainian Workers' University. They had one go at this starting in February 1929 in Winnipeg with 80 students. An ill-fated attempt to set up a union of Ukrainian people's homes. One of the main networks that existed was all these Narodny domy, national homes or people's homes throughout Canada, the majority of which were positively disposed to the Samostiniki, but there was potential for building on that base. The bottom problem was their charter was almost identical to the one that had been set up by the Samostiniki, who set up their own union of Ukrainian people's homes, and so that got shut down in short order. Scientific research and assessment regarding Ukrainian Canadian affairs through the Canadian Ukrainian Scientific Research Society established July 1930, and I haven't heard too much about it. And the All-Ukrainian Educational Economic Conference, December 1929. Neither of these took off, but still, Mandryka did play a role as a consultant in one of the classic works on Ukrainians in Canada. That's Charles Young's The Ukrainian Canadians, A Study in Assimilation, 1931. And setting up branches of the Ukrainian Labor Association, None of these ventures was an out-and-out success. A significant part of the problem was the onset of the Great Depression, which made the funding of new ventures even more precarious and eliminated the possibility of bringing in reinforcements from Prague to assist with the work. Beyond that were other difficulties, including the fact that the workers' university-style courses were, quote-unquote, culturally foreign to people in North America. This is by Mandryka's own admission. And also, people in North America, the Ukrainians, their target group, the younger group, was starting to become less fluent in the Ukrainian language, whereas Ukrainians in Europe had a greater fluency. So you just had that logistical problem as well. The opposition, not just of the Socialistich, who had effectively headed the SRs at the past by setting up the USRL, although if Mandryka had been successful in his mission to set up Ukrainian workers' societies and establishing an SR presence in Canada, this might have been another matter. And also the fact that the Socialistich were dead set against him, quoting Miroslav Stichishin in a letter to his brother, "Nam treba biti sius svolic bez pardonu." The failure to establish a secure funding base, they tried to take over a Ukrainian mutual aid society, Vzaimna Pomich, that didn't work. The Socialistich had earlier, taken that over. The fact that these were at least initially socialistically oriented ventures operating among a general conservative population, and the breakdown of relations between Mandryka and the SRs over ideology and possibly finances. Already by 1931, Mandryka was starting to feel isolated in his mission. He decided to continue with the Ukrainian workers' associations with or without SR support, and they actually supported him in his struggles against the Centralia. Mandryka spent much of the years 1932, traveling across Canada, delivering public lectures, taking 12 trips coast to coast with at least 200 talks delivered. In 1932-33, the group rented a hall on McGregor Avenue near the Ukrainian Labor Temple with, interestingly enough, the Ukrainian War Veterans Association, and then moving to the Chitaina Prasvita, which was a bit more, aligned ideologically in 1934. By this time, however, the main focus of Ukrainian Labor Association activity, as much as it existed, has shifted to Eastern Canada, where by 1934 it was clearly struggling and probably faded away. So, to sum up, Mandryka's presence, if he had been successful, certainly would have eaten into the support of the newly established Ukrainian Self-Reliance League. The initiative that led to his coming to Canada was instrumental in actually finally forcing the Socialistich to set up a formal organization. And I think quite safely you can say that he at least siphoned off a certain amount of support from the Ukrainian Canadian pro-communist left. Thank you for your attention.